This podcast is part of the MyPodcast.com network. Go online right now and get your very own 100% free podcast, MyPodcast.com.
What's the morale of the people in New Orleans like these days?
Well, it's hard to say because there's so few people on the streets. Not having been here this long and not having much opportunity to walk around, it seemed both cleaner and sleazier than I remember it. You know, it always sort of had that pleasant sleaziness to it, but it just seems more commercial than ever. And I think it's sort of turning in the French Quarter, where the tourists and people here for meetings end up is being turned into more of a theme park.
Interesting.
So there's less garbage on the streets, but the sleazy outlets are sleazier than ever. So.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. I think my view of it is kind of colored by what I know happened and how political, half the destruction was political, not the hurricane. The government actually tore down public housing that was unaffected by the hurricane because they saw the hurricane as a way to clean up the elements of New Orleans they didn't like, which was basically poor black people. And it's now...
Yes, I know that, yeah.
Yeah, it's now a majority white city, which is... just an illustration of how successful they were.
Right. Okay. I just thought we'd set the scene because you are in New Orleans after all.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's a city I have a great affection for. It's so different than where I come from in Canada.
Yeah, I'll bet. Okay. Do you want to have a look at some of these questions we were discussing?
Yeah. I'd love to talk about AIDS from more of a philosophical point of view, because I think that it's sort of AIDS is sort of a negative spiritual belief. It's people believe in AIDS because it touches really deep down in their consciousness at levels of fear that are very much in their subconscious.
Yeah, definitely.
And, death and sex mixed together kind of touch pretty deep levels of humanity.
Very Freudian.
I think so. And also it touches on beliefs about racism. An integral part of the mainstream belief of AIDS is that AIDS is most serious a problem in sub-Saharan Africa, and that means that it must be black men who are the most sexually irresponsible. That's what the system has to rely on, and that's a pretty deep belief amongst white people. And it's ironic, I'm in New Orleans, the heart of the U.S. South, where those beliefs were very strong, that it was very easy for white people, if there was an accusation that a black man had raped a white woman, that was absolutely the worst crime, and it was believed that black men had to be kept in line. And AIDS is a sort of a more sophisticated twist on the same old idea. And like I was saying about New Orleans, it's kind of a cleaner system because it's coated in white lab coats and science, but it's also sleazier and dirtier, and in the end could kill far more black people than were ever lynched in the southern United States.
Yeah.
I was just reading a paper from Rakai, Uganda, which is a very poor part of Uganda, and they've been promoting formula feeding amongst HIV-positive mothers for quite some time, and this paper showed that the risk of death was 6 times higher amongst formula-fed infants. Multiply that by perhaps 10 or 20% of the population in Africa being HIV positive, depending on where you are, and every one of the mothers amongst that group formula feeding, and you have literally millions of people being killed by this belief that breast milk is dangerous amongst certain women. And that's also a very deep belief amongst scientific people, that there's something wrong with breastfeeding. It's been a really negative idea since, I think, the late 1800s when formula feeding became possible.
Well, in view of facts like this, do you ever wonder why people can't stand back and look at the ridiculous attitudes that they entertain towards this AIDS, HIV subject? It's incredible that people can even conceive of looking at this thing in ridiculous ways, not focusing on the facts, totally disregarding any research done, and adopting a belief because it's a mainstream belief.
Well, I think it is because it has been embedded in their subconscious that they don't actually think about it at a conscious level. The idea of a good propaganda campaign works because when people hear certain keywords, strong emotions kick in, and they don't need to think rationally about it. At least they don't think they do. So I've been told many times by people when I'm trying to explain this, they'll say, well, that's all well and good, but millions of people are dying in Africa. And where did that come from? I mean, have they been to Africa and seen the millions of people? And even if they had, would they have, known if they were dying of AIDS or malnutrition or tuberculosis?
No, and I've had the same response from people as you have about Africa, the very same response.
Yeah, so it's this deeply embedded belief. They just know this is true, and they would probably defend that this is a scientific belief, that millions of people are dying in Africa because I've read it in so many places. It's got to be a scientific belief. But you can only really acquire scientific beliefs by experimentation, very careful observation, or by analysis of published science and, sort of a comparative analysis of the various science that's out there. You can't acquire scientific beliefs by reading Time magazine or listening to, an important journalist on the radio or the television. That's faith. You believe what you've heard on the television because you trust the person who said it. And you might trust the person who said it because they're wearing a suit, they have a nice deep voice, because they're on a powerful channel. There's many reasons where you subconsciously trust people even though you actually don't have any information to confirm or deny what they're saying, and you don't actually have any information about whether that person who's saying it actually has financial conflicts of interest or their radio station does or any of those different things.
It's as if the person who believes the mainstream view is actually hypnotized.
Well, yes. I mean, it's kind of interesting that one of the early people to fight back against this was Michael Elner of HEAL, Health Education Action Liaison. He helped found it in New York City, and he's a hypnotherapist. So I think maybe he has an understanding of how people become, how masses of people become hypnotized all at once. I think that's what happened to the population of Germany during the Nazi era and in many other dictatorships as well. I think that's the only explanation I can find for why, even in George Bush's darkest hours, still a pretty significant percentage of the population strongly backed him. despite the chaos.
On what